Rancher lived alone for years, until the Bigfoot placed a locket in his hand. It gave me something I never thought I'd find again. Before we begin, take a moment to drop a comment with your city. Where are you watching from tonight? And when the story's over, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Now, settle in and enjoy. The winter wind swept hard across the brittle prairie grass, carrying with it the husky, haunting notes of a harmonica drifting from somewhere deep in memory. Far off, the slow, steady rhythm of horse hooves beat along a dusty red trail leading toward a lone ranch pressed against the thick pine woods of Montana. This morning, a blanket of white fog lay over the forest like a cold shroud, and when the rancher stepped out into the yard, his breath vanished into the frozen air. At the edge of the trees, Bigfoot stood motionless, one massive hand holding up a small silver locket, its surface catching the weak light of the winter sun. The rancher's chest tightened as recognition struck. It was his mother's locket, the very one that had been gone for so many years. Winter never brings much, except loss. In the high country of Montana, winter doesn't arrive with rain or the call of migratory birds. It comes on the back of a silence so deep it feels alive. The prairie stretches endlessly, every blade of grass sheathed in a thin coat of ice, glinting faintly under the pale blue-gray sky. From the far-off mountains, the wind sweeps through the pines, shaking loose snow from their branches so it drifts down like cold ash. Caleb Hargrove's ranch stands quiet at the forest's edge, a weathered log cabin with a roof heavy under the weight of snow, a sagging fence line, and a small horse shed nearby. At 46, Caleb has lived alone for over a decade. His hands are calloused from long days of labor, his eyes trained to read the far horizon for signs of the hard season. No one here knows he once handled a gun better than most men alive, or why he walked away from the towns that used to know his name. This morning he shrugged into a sheepskin coat, the strap of his rifle resting loose over one shoulder, and stepped out to check his traps. The snow squeaked under his boots with every step. But at the tree line, he stopped cold. There, pressed deep into the frozen crust, was a trail of tracks, larger than any he'd ever seen. So deep the snow was banked up around the edges, the prints running straight into the shadows between the pines. The wind cut through him, carrying a chill that sank straight to the bone, and with it came something else, half warning, half pull. These weren't the tracks of any animal he'd hunted, or any he'd ever had cause to fear. Part 1. The Encounter. Dawn had just brushed a thin streak of gold across the horizon, light slipping through the veil of morning mist and glinting off the fresh snow that had fallen in the night. Caleb Hargrove paused at the fence line, his calloused hand gripping the rifle stock. On the white crust before him lay a string of tracks, clear as if carved by a blade, twice the size of a grown man's footprint, the toes long and splayed apart. They stretched from the pine forest all the way to the ranch yard, then looped back and disappeared into the dark between the trees. The wind swept in from the prairie behind him, rattling the saddle straps hanging from the porch and carrying the dry scent of horsehide. Somewhere far off, a rifle cracked, likely another rancher testing his sights before hunting season. Caleb stood unmoving, the cold creeping into him from more than just the weather. He'd heard the stories of something that lived deep in these woods, but he'd never expected to see its trail right outside his own door. He stepped forward slowly, the snow squealing under his boots, following the tracks toward the trees. The air here felt different, so still that he could hear the thump of his own heartbeat and the wind threading through the pines. Then he stopped. Between the trunks, a massive silhouette emerged. Bigfoot stood there, straight-backed, nearly 8 feet tall, its dark brown coat stirring with the breeze. But unlike any wild creature Caleb had ever seen, it didn't bolt. It didn't snarl. It simply stood, its deep black eyes catching the pale morning light. In one fur-covered hand, something small caught a glimmer, silver shining like a shard of moonlight against the snow. There was no roar, no pounding rush from the underbrush, none of the terror tales told over whiskey in the town saloon. Only the steady plume of the creature's breath drifting into the cold air. Caleb's pulse raced with caution, yet slowed with wonder. This scene was nothing like what he'd believed. Not a predator. not a monster lurking in the dark. It was waiting. A gust swept through curling snow between them. When the air cleared, Bigfoot lifted its arm, extending that silver object forward. Caleb tilted his head, recognition cutting through him like a blade. It was a locket. Old, round, thin, the kind meant to hold a family photograph. And with that, the blizzard of memory came. The night his mother's cabin had been ransacked when he was just 10 years old. The precious keepsakes stolen, including her silver locket. He'd thought it long gone, pawned off for a handful of coins in some dusty bar by a drifter. But here it was in the hand of a living legend. And Caleb wasn't sure whether to feel fear or gratitude. His grip on the rifle tightened, not to fire, but to steady himself against the quake rising inside him. Bigfoot stepped forward, the snow crunching under its tremendous weight. Now they were barely 15 feet apart. The creature crouched, placed the locket gently in the snow, then slowly backed away. The silver gleamed against the white, flashing with each breath of wind. And in that moment the world narrowed to just this, the falling snow, 2 plumes of breath in the cold air, and a family heirloom thought lost forever. Caleb bent down, picking it up. The chill of the metal bit into his fingers. Almost without thinking, his thumb pressed the clasp and the locket opened inside a faded photograph of his mother. Her gentle face, her eyes looking as though they saw clear through the years. He looked up, meeting Bigfoot's gaze once more. No longer a fireside myth, no longer a shadowed threat, but something that could find, keep safe, and return. The wind shifted, carrying the distant drum of hoofbeats from somewhere on the open range. A flock of crows burst from the treetops, their cries fading into the gray sky. Caleb knew he had stepped into a new country of truth where the line between legend and life blurred thin. He tightened his grip on the locket, feeling it as more than cold metal. It was a bridge binding past to present. If you were standing there with a legend handing you a piece of your own history, what would you do? Part 2. The Wordless Gift. That morning, the ranch yard felt as if the world had forgotten it. The wind slipped through the fence slats, spinning a few dry, golden strands of hay into the air before letting them settle back onto the snow. Out front, Bigfoot still stood, its massive form like something carved from stone, the only movement the thick clouds of breath rolling from its chest. Caleb Hargrove wasn't used to having a creature like that within a few strides of him. The rifle still hung from his shoulder, but he felt no urge to lift it. Before him, resting on the untouched snow, lay the silver locket, its glint, the single drop of light in a world washed pale and gray. It felt like looking into a doorway to his past. All the winters of loss came flooding back at once: the winter his mother passed, the winter he left town, the winter the cabin was ransacked. And now this winter, the locket had returned. Not by human hands, but by the hand of a legend. He knelt, his knees sinking into the soft snow, and picked it up. The metal was biting cold, so cold it stung the tips of his fingers. Turning it in his palm, his thumb found the rusted clasp and pressed it open. Inside, his mother's photograph stared back at him, faded, the lines blurring into one another, but her eyes still shone as though they were looking straight through him. He could remember her hand on his hair, her voice soft as wood smoke, speaking of spring and wildflowers on the hillside. The wind whispered in his ear, carrying the far-off crack of a gun from somewhere on the range. Maybe someone was pushing cattle, maybe testing a rifle before the snowstorm hit. Either way, the world beyond still turned, but in this moment, everything seemed to pause to witness this silent exchange. Bigfoot stepped back a few paces, its gaze locked on him. No threat in its stance, no growl in its throat, only waiting. Caleb rose to his feet, pulling his coat collar tight against the cold. He thought of the nights in Helena's saloon, listening to drifters tell of the ghost in the pines and herds scattering at the sight of it. They'd laugh over whiskey, but fear still flickered in their eyes. Standing here now, he saw something else. Not a ghost, not a monster, but someone or something that knew how to keep safe what people had lost. Sometimes that meant an object, sometimes a memory. A strong gust swept across the prairie, carrying with it a haze of red dust strange for a winter's day, but not unheard of in dry spells. From somewhere nearby, a flock of crows lifted into the air, circling once before disappearing into the trees. The horse shed shuddered under the wind, the saddle straps tapping a wooden post in a slow, steady rhythm. Bigfoot hadn't moved, though its shoulders shifted, as if bracing against the cold. Its eyes stayed fixed on Caleb, as though confirming that the gift had been received. This moment didn't need words. Both understood that an act like this could only happen where some measure of trust existed. Caleb gave a slight nod, not to a man but to a fellow being who had touched something deep within him. Bigfoot turned toward the forest, walking with deliberate steps, though it didn't vanish immediately. It stopped, glanced back as if to say the story wasn't over. Caleb tightened his hold on the locket, feeling as if he were holding a piece of his own soul that had been gone too long. The wind eased, and in that hush he understood that this winter was different. Not just because the locket had returned, but because of a fragile, rare belief. A belief in the strange, the improbable, the kind of wonder the harsh West seldom allowed. If someone, or something, returned to you what you thought was gone forever, would you trust it? Part 3. When Memories Return. Winter light lay thin across the ranch yard, the kind that makes a man's breath look older than his years. Caleb Hargrove stood there, the silver locket open in his hands, noticing the slight tremor in his fingers. It wasn't the cold, though the wind was biting every knuckle. It was the weight of what he held. Not weight in ounces, but in years. Inside, the photograph had faded, little more than a winter pond veiled in mist. Yet his mother's eyes were still there, deep, bright, warm. Eyes that had endured every winter, every loss, every mile he'd traveled. They held him now the way they had when he was 10 years old, standing in the wreckage of life's first shocks, her hand the last thing left to hold on to. A breeze from the pines carried the faint clink of saddle straps swaying outside the horse, shed the dry metallic sound, like a harmonica trembling in the cold. Far out on the range, a gunshot rang echoing into emptiness before fading. It was the sound of the West gunfire, hoofbeats whined slicing through grass. The music of wild country had been in Caleb's blood since boyhood. He glanced toward the woods. The space between the trunks seemed to press together like a breath held in the dark. Maybe the giant creature had gone slipping into places only it knew. But Caleb was certain of one thing: it understood the worth of this locket, and it had chosen to give it back. "Ma!" The word slipped out soft as steam and vanished into the air. He turned the locket in his palm, the silver catching a thin shard of winter sun. Touching it was like pressing a healed scar, still tender, still alive. He slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat and stood a long time in the white expanse of the yard. Everything felt at once far away and close, like the horizon of the West. Back inside, he lit the cast-iron stove, feeding it small sticks of pine before laying on a heavier log. The fire grew slow and warm, its soft crackle carrying him back to a summer long gone. He sipped black coffee, eyes fixed on the locket lying on the table. When he closed his eyes, the sky was dark blue, as indigo dye, the grasslands blazing gold under the sun. From the horizon, a red wall of dust rolled toward them, high plains, storm the kind that could tear down fence lines and send cattle into a frenzy. He was 8 years old, standing in the horse shed, clinging to a wooden rail as the pounding of hooves filled the air. His father was out in the storm, driving the herd together, staring down the wind itself. His mother knelt beside him, wrapping a quilt around his shoulders. Through the howl of wind and the smell of dry dust, she opened the locket, showing him the family photograph. "Whenever you're scared, look here," she said. Those words now came back as if she were beside him, her voice alive in the room. A rare smile broke across Caleb's face, strange after so many years. But the warmth of that memory was chased by another darker winter night. Snow had fallen all day, silent and deep, until the pounding of hooves shattered the quiet. 3 men burst into the cabin, eyes red, reeking of whiskey and desperation, food fire, and money. One rasped a pistol, twitching in his grip. His mother stood firm in front of the table, her voice shaking. but her gaze unyielding. "You'll get the fire and the food. The money. No." The man's eyes swept the room, stopping on the locket. His hand shot out before she could react. The locket vanished into his filthy coat pocket. Caleb had sprung to his feet, his boy's voice sharp and certain. "Don't." The gun swung toward him. His mother stepped in front just as a rifle cracked somewhere outside, making all three men flinch. They bolted for the door, leaving chaos in their wake and the empty space where the locket had been. That night, his mother pressed her hand to his chest and whispered, "We're not broken." Those words had followed him through the years, but the absence of the locket remained a wound that never closed. Now, standing in that same yard, he felt time fold in on itself. The crows cried from the edge of the woods, the wind carried the scent of pine sap, and in his hand rested what had once been the heart of a night of loss. The locket was ice cold, yet from it came a slow warmth, the warmth of memory of keeping. Caleb looked toward the forest, sure the creature was still out there watching. He wondered, did Bigfoot understand it had just returned a piece of his memory? Or did it simply know this thing wasn't meant to be its own? A soft breeze carried the faint smell of wood smoke from somewhere far off. Caleb fastened the locket deep inside his coat, guarding it as if it were part of his heart, come back from the dead. At the tree-line, shadows shifted. It could have been the wind, or it could have been a pair of eyes still watching. In that quiet, Caleb understood not everything lost stays gone. Sometimes it just waits for the right moment to find its way back. If a piece of your past returned to you after decades, would it heal you or haunt you? Part 4. The Invitation into the Woods. The snow in the ranch yard had yet to cover Caleb's footprints when Bigfoot turned away, its massive frame moving like a slow-living mountain against the white and gray. Each step sank deep, stamping the snow as if carving marks into the earth itself. At the tree line, it paused, glancing back. That look wasn't from a predator. It felt more like a summons. Caleb tightened his grip on the silver locket, the chill of the metal seeping into his skin. He knew that if he turned back to the cabin, life would go on as before, quiet, solitary, and without answers for the strange morning he'd just lived. But if he followed, he'd be placing himself right between legend and truth. Far off, a single gunshot cracked the air low short, likely a rancher testing his rifle before the snowstorm rolled in. The wind swept across the prairie, carrying a haze of red dust from a bare patch the snow hadn't yet claimed. The sight stirred memories, long rides in the saddle, driving scattered cattle back to safety through choking sandstorms. Back then, only quick decisions saved a herd. Now was no different. Step forward or miss the chance. He left the yard, passing through the leaning rails of the old wooden fence. The tracks led into the trees, patches of white broken by the shadowed columns of towering pines. Here the snow lay deeper, the wind softer, but the cold sharper, close and personal. Each step he took, the snow gave a muffled drumbeat under his boots. The air thickened as though the outside world had been left behind entirely. Caleb remembered the skeptical faces in town whenever someone spoke of the ghost in the pines. They'd ask if you ever saw it, would you dare get close? Now Caleb had his answer. Ahead, Bigfoot paused again, glancing back a second time. The distance between them never closed, as if the creature meant for him to choose freely, not be driven. Caleb realized he was no longer just a follower, he was becoming a participant. The deeper they went, the forest turned into a maze of straight, sky-reaching trunks. Overhead, the sky was reduced to torn scraps of gray-blue. Bigfoot's path curved and twisted, avoiding sunken drifts and rotting logs. Caleb matched its movements, noticing how effortlessly it moved through the wilderness, wasting no strength. A sudden gust hissed through the pines, carrying with it a sound Caleb knew from summers past, the distant scream of wind across open range before a dust storm. For a moment, he was 15 again, astride his black gelding, racing to head off a panicked herd. In the storm's chaos, his father had glanced back at him just like Bigfoot was doing now, as if to say, "Follow, and you'll understand." Those memories seemed to fuse with the present, and Caleb felt he was walking a road longer than his own lifetime. Somewhere ahead lay a truth the West had never written down. Suddenly, Bigfoot veered into a narrow cut between two moss-covered boulders. Caleb followed, and the ground beneath changed. Here the snow was disturbed by more than just massive footprints. Hoofprints, human boot tracks, long grooves, as if heavy crates or barrels had been dragged through. Some were old, nearly erased by weather, but enough remained to tell him this was no path walked by one creature alone. His pulse quickened. He remembered the talk in the saloon tools, family heirlooms, even letters vanishing from ranches across the territory, with never a sign of the thief. The trail here told a different story. Those things had gone somewhere. Bigfoot stopped, turning halfway toward him, as if to measure whether Caleb was ready to cross another threshold. Caleb drew in a breath, the scent of pine pitch and frozen air filling his lungs, then gave a small nod. The narrow path opened into a shallow basin where shafts of light pierced the canopy, laying pale gold bars across the snow. Bigfoot stood at the edge, moving forward in slow strides, looking back each time, not a word spoken, no gesture forcing him, but the meaning clear. This was an invitation, and in that moment, the formless fear he'd carried about the creature melted like frost in sunlight, replaced by something else, a blend of curiosity and respect. Caleb knew he was about to walk into a chapter only the bold ever saw. His hand went to his chest, feeling the locket beneath his coat. "All right," he murmured, and stepped into the land of shadows and secrets. If you were in Caleb's boots, would you follow a legend into the unknown or turn back to the safety of your own door? Part 5. The Secret in the Dark. The forest ahead of Caleb was a wall of thick shadow. Bigfoot led him beneath the old pines to a narrow split in the rock, nearly hidden under roots and snow. Faint light from above slipped down just enough to reveal an opening, not the gaping cave mouth he'd imagined, but a slit in the stone that a man would have to turn sideways to pass through. Caleb drew in a long breath. His exhale became a pale cloud, vanishing into the cold air. Far beyond the trees, a gunshot echoed, the sound ricocheting off the rock, as if to remind him that the other world was still moving, cattle being driven, dust storms gathering on the horizon. But here was a place outside of time. He laid a hand against the icy stone, feeling grooves worn into it, as though something massive had passed this way many times. Bigfoot slipped sideways through its great shoulders, just fitting. Its shadow disappeared into the dark. Caleb clenched the locket in his fist, then followed. Inside, the air was damp, thick with the scent of moss and stone. Only a few threads of sunlight filtered down from cracks above, hanging like golden wires in the gloom. It took his eyes a moment to adjust, then the space opened wide before him, the ceiling arching high as a cathedral. The stone floor wasn't strewn with debris as he'd expected. Everything was arranged with care. An old saddle with leather worn soft, a woman's wool coat hanging from a wooden peg, a small tin box stuffed with yellowed letters, household things, a clay jug, an oil lamp, a chipped ceramic bowl. Each piece was weathered by years, yet kept clean. Caleb stepped slowly, his boots knocking faint echoes off the rock. At every pace, he recognized another thing he'd heard spoken of in town: lost, stolen, never found again. He turned toward Bigfoot. The giant stood still, making no move to approach, only watching. Kneeling beside an old wooden chest, Caleb lifted its lid. Inside lay carved wooden toys, a little wheeled cart he remembered seeing once in the hands of a child from the Whitmore Ranch. He touched it lightly, dust clinging to his fingertips. And then it struck him this was no thief's hoard. It was a vault of memory. Things misplaced, abandoned, or taken by cruel hands had been brought here, kept intact as though waiting for the day they could be returned. He thought of his own locket, of the huge hand that had set it down in the snow that morning. In the cave's cold and quiet, that thought lit something inside him. Maybe this creature wasn't the ghost of the deep woods people whispered about. Maybe it was a guardian keeping safe the scattered pieces of human life. A sudden gust whistled through the cave mouth, pulling Caleb back to the present. He stepped toward the opening and peered out through the narrow gap. Far on the open ground, a drift of dust moved across the horizon, perhaps cattle being pushed hard, or strangers on horseback passing through. He remembered the smirks, the rolled eyes in the saloon whenever Bigfoot stories came up, mockery from some, fear from a few. Caleb knew that if he told what he'd seen here, almost no one would believe him. In the West, belief mattered less than the choice of what a man would do next. He turned back. Bigfoot was still there, its gaze deep and steady, as if asking, "Now do you understand?" Caleb nodded, not only to answer the creature, but as a promise to himself. He walked closer, resting his hand over his chest, where the locket lay beneath his coat. He thought about saying thank you, but knew it wasn't needed. Here, silence was enough. Bigfoot turned away, moving deeper into the cave, leaving Caleb alone. He understood that he'd likely never find his way back here unless he was led again. He stepped backward toward the entrance until the winter light outside swallowed him. The cold wind rushed in, mixing the scent of pine pitch with the bite of snow. From this day forward, he would never see Bigfoot as a thing to fear. In his heart, it was the keeper of memories, and now he was part of its story. If you discovered the legend you feared was actually a keeper of memories, would you share the truth or keep it as your own secret? Final part. The thread in the snow. That afternoon, the ranch kitchen glowed warm from the cast iron stove, the fire inside burning low but steady. On the dark wooden table, the silver locket rested beside a steaming cup of coffee, its surface catching the thin light spilling through the frosted window. Caleb Hargrove sat there, one hand wrapped around the mug, his gaze drifting toward the pine woods still draped in snow. Out there, the wind still moved through the trees, but it no longer carried the sound of threat. It felt more like the long, slow sigh of an old friend, distant, yet knowing the way home. The dark tree line stood silent, but Caleb could feel a presence watching from somewhere deep inside. No fear now, no doubt. Only a quiet connection that felt as real as the frost on the window. He picked up the locket, letting it rest in his palm. The cold metal now held warmth, not only from the memory of his mother, but from a winter morning that had changed the way he saw the world. In a rancher's life, there aren't many things that shift a man's view. But when they come, they carve deep like a horse's hoof mark in dry earth. Outside, a single gunshot echoed familiar as the West itself, blending with the smell of coffee, the scent of pine pitch, and the quiet weight of gratitude. Caleb knew not every gift comes wrapped in paper. Some come from places you never expect. And when they do, they open a different door inside you. He set the locket back beside the coffee cup and leaned into his chair, eyes still on the woods. Somewhere out there in the dark between the trees ran an invisible thread, a bond between a man and a legend who knew how to keep memories safe. Some gifts come from where you least expect, and they can change the way you see the whole world. If you found a keepsake you thought was gone forever, would you hold on to it, or seek out the reason it came back? If you were the rancher, would you have stayed, or ridden away into the wild? Let me know in the comments.